What I want to share with you are my thoughts about how, on the question of growth, this debate about why minimum wages are so high. Not the question whether they should be so high, I can't resolve that. But as a historian, I can say why they were set high and why policies were inflexible has something to do with an older phase of Indian nationalism. And so in some ways, one might say that one of the key debates in the present elections is actually a clash, has to do with a clash between an older sense of nationalism and a more new, different post-liberalization sense of nationalism. So what I'm going to, so for your comprehension, what I'll do is quickly divide the history of Indian nationalism into two phases. One I'll call cultural nationalism. And cultural nationalism in India grew roughly from the end of the 19th century to the end of the First World War. And India became independent in 1947, and between 1920 and 1947 grew what I might call political nationalism. So by political nationalism, I mean a political process where elections became important, even though there was limited franchise. Even at independence, even though the British had given Indians more vote, only 14% of the population could vote. But compared to zero almost in the 19th century, it's all that expansion of the voting base happened between, let's say, 1919 and 1947. And then that phase, that was the phase when Muslims organized to win votes and seats. The lower castes organized to win votes and seats, and that was the phase that eventually led to the formation of Pakistan and the formation of India's affirmative action policy, the so-called reservation policy that India follows with so-called scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. All that was, so that phase I'm calling political nationalism. But before that, there was a phase of nationalism which was not so focused on elections. In fact, it was a phase when nationalists thought elections were less important than proving to the West that we were culturally superior to the West. And that was the phase of what I call cultural nationalism. But it was also a phase of an intense intellectual conversation with the West. I'm going to at least try to show to you the ways in which the question of high minimum wage and inflexible labor policies, which favor labor, have something to do with that older phase of nationalism, which now, as nationalism, counts for nothing almost in India. The people associated with that older phase have now become iconic. In other words, we respect them and consider them irrelevant. And there's a long list of people like that. I'll be talking about four of them. Of three, I have pictures to show you. So, when Europeans developed this idea of civilization and the idea of civilizing others, Indians didn't have the word civilization, which we actually had to translate the word civilization in different Indian languages to coin a new word. And the word civilization once had a connection had the same root as the word civility. Though Europeans actually created out of it, by the end of the 18th century, a sense of higher civilization, lower civilization, uncivilized peoples, which also at the same time kind of legitimized in their own eyes their right to rule others. And Indians actually accepted that idea of civilization, Indian nationalist leaders, and sometimes turned it against Europeans to say that if you're really that civilized, why are you not more civil with us? But by that gesture, they were restoring that old connection between the word civilization and the word civility, which in the course of the history of those two words had become separate words. It's as if like Europeans had forgotten the connection between civilization and civility. And Indian criticism of Europeans was often to remind them. And alongside that went also the claim that we were at least as civilized as they were, given our past. So civilization was a very, very competitive word. And politics in those days, so I'm talking about the end of the 19th century, politics was defined not so much as how many votes you could get. Indians didn't have the vote in that sense. Politics was defined over kind of cultural activities that would express this sense of both a shared meaning of the word civilization and a competitive claim or claims over who was more civilized. One interesting point in this, of course, the Indian experience, and I think which was relevant to globally, was to then find out in this process that in order to compete with the West, or even to argue that you were better, you were better able to do it, better able to present that argument to the world if you had allies in the West. And therefore, people in the West who were also critical of European imperialism became friends of Indian nationalists. So actually this conversation about civilization led to the realization that every civilization is plural. Every civilization has differences within itself. And ultimately, I'll show that it gave rise to the idea that you're truly civilized when you can use the differences within your civilization as a basis for reflecting back on yourself. In other words, the truly civilized has a capacity for self-critique and self-reflexivity. And in some ways so it was an interesting, I would say, end of 19th century to early 20th, there was all kinds of interesting movements in the landscape of ideas. Not that Indians all agreed with one another. Even amongst the people I'll talk about, they all disagreed between themselves on what exactly civilization meant. But the word was shared. Some of the assumptions were shared. And I think this experience was shared, that if you wanted to engage Western civilization, that what you discovered soon is that it was not monolithic. It was not one thing. That in the name of Western civilization, there were Western people disagreeing with other Western people about what they might be doing in the world. So I'll quickly go through these iconic people, the highly respected and considered irrelevant people, or sometimes even forgotten. And my first case in point is, of course, somebody whose 150th anniversary we're celebrating this year, and in whose name we have instituted a permanent visiting professorship at the university. So a religious person, Swami Vivekananda, who actually came and spoke in Chicago at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, and the government of India, to mark his 150th anniversary, gave us some money with which to institute this professorship. So Vivekananda came to Chicago and made his name by speaking successfully at the World Parliament of Religions held in Chicago in 1893. He reportedly abandoned the stiff formality of the gathering to address his audience as sisters and brothers of America. You know, contemporary accounts by Americans of that event, something very special happened that day. I don't know, he got inspired. He says that he was very nervous, and he was praying to his guru, Ramakrishna, so that he could speak well, and to the goddess Saraswati, I guess, so that, as we say, she could kind of take possession of his tongue. But he got up, and at the end of the day, while everybody was formal, had been formal and stiff, he just said, and he was, you can see, a handsome young man. So the moment he said, "My sisters and brothers of America," apparently all the women in the gathering sort of scrambled to get forward and be close to him. And there was an American woman there, Mrs. Blodgett, who was there and who writes her own memoirs of that incident. And she said, "I thought to myself, young man, if you can overcome that temptation, then you're really God in front of me." But Vivekananda, before he came, he wrote letters. And his letters, because he had a very famous disciple in Madras, which is now Chennai, called Alasinga Perumal. And some of the letters show very clearly that perception that I was talking about, that civilization was a very competitive word. It was comparative, but also competitive. So in one letter, he actually says, this is 1895, after he's spoken, and he's talking about his success in the United States. And he says, India is now in the air, and the Orthodox Christian clergy are struggling hard to put out the fire. And then he says, if you could send and maintain for a few years a dozen well-educated, strong men to preach in Europe and America, you would do immense service to India, both morally and politically, he said. So that's why I'm saying that politics was about this cultural competition. It was not about getting votes in your own country. And then he says, many of the Western people think of you as a nation of half-naked savages, and therefore only fit to be whipped into civilization. If you 300 millions become cowed by the missionaries, what can one man do in a distant land? But, as I said, for all the success that he wrote about, his success was dependent on American women. And there's a very interesting letter where he actually says in 1993, the trouble he was getting into walking American streets, wearing his typical, the garments that he would have worn back in India as somebody who would renounce the world. And in Indian terms, I don't know if this will evoke a picture, he would have looked like a fakir. Sort of patched up clothes, he wore a turban, and he was getting into trouble on American streets. So when he went to Boston, he said, I landed in Boston, a stranger in a strange land. My coat was like this, and I wore my turban, and I was proceeding up a street in a busy part of town when I became aware that I was followed by a great number of men and boys. I hastened my pace, and they did too. And then something struck my shoulder. Somebody threw something at him. And I began to run, dashing around a corner and up a dark passage, just before the mob in full pursuit swept past, and I was safe. And then he says, so what I want to do now is to dress only when I lecture in a red robe and turban, but only when I lecture, not in public. And this was the dress. And he says, for that is what the ladies advise me to do. And they are the rulers here, and I must have their sympathy. So there is a buried history, and I'm not an American historian or historian of America to tease it all out, but there's obviously a buried history of women's activism in America, or even feminism of certain sorts of that time, which I can only parenthetically acknowledge, but cannot bring out in detail. But even the little bits of information you get from his biography says something. Something like, for instance, one of his early hostesses and patrons in Boston, Mrs. Kate Sanborn, was herself a lecturer, an author, who wrote about country life and composed small poems for friends that clearly spoke of her thoughts about men. Like this small poem that Miss Sanborn wrote said, though you're bright and though you're pretty, they will not love you if you're witty. Another of the Swami's hostess, Mrs. Kate Tennant Woods, was also a lecturer and author who wrote many books, including Hester Hepworth, a story about the witchcraft delusion. But these were clearly individuals and families interested in looking beyond the West. So in the end, what Vivekananda took back from the West was really that the West was internally different. And he clearly thrived on the support he got from women. And he took that idea back to India and often said, he didn't like public demonstration of affection by Western people. So whenever he saw couples on the ship coming to America, he hated them. He said, why do they have to kiss in public? That's terrible. He said, we mustn't practice, we mustn't show affection the way they do it. But we have to learn something from Western women and the role they have in public life. So it sort of modified his idea of how an ideal Indian woman should be like. And he was actually arguing back home that they should imbibe something from Western women, learn something from Western women and make that Indian. So even though civilization was competitive, and he was trying to prove at the World Parliament of Religions that the Hindus had the best conception of divinity of all the religions, and therefore there was no reason for conversion from one religion to another. In spite of that competitiveness, at the same time, there was also this learning that was happening. And therefore, within that competitive context, there was a lot of conversation going on. Same experience was had by, this is another photo of Vivekananda taken in America. Why Gandhi and Tagore are the two people I also want to talk about. And Gandhi had the same experience. And that like when he went as a student to the West, it really were people belonging to groups that had been marginalized in the West that became his friends. So priests, theosophists, vegetarians, homosexuals, not the mainstream West. And Gandhi's lesson very much was that within the West, there was this friendly West. And he took that back. Or anti-imperial activists like Henry Salt. It was after the end of the First World War that, and actually before the First World War, Gandhi wrote a book called Hind Swaraj. It's kind of his manifesto, completely utopian book that he wrote in 1909 while on the ship coming back to India once from South Africa. And he discusses, there's a whole chapter on civilization. And of course, Gandhi by civilization meant industrial civilization. And as you know, Gandhi thought everything was wrong with industrial civilization. To be civil was very good. To be educated was very good. To be reasonable was very good. To pursue reason and value reason was very good. He once said, when I talk about village, I mean villages that have libraries and hospitals. All that was good, but he somehow never took to cities, never took to industries. And actually, so for him, again, Western civilization was a kind of, industrial civilization was a kind of sickness from which the world had to be cured. And the fact that many people in India wanted that civilization for Gandhi only showed that the sickness was global. And his message always was, he moved to, there are two very well-known people whose careers were made after they were 50. They really sort of blossomed. And until I was 50, I used to take hope looking at these people, but obviously I've given up. But these are Gandhi and Freud. Their careers just took off after that. And Gandhi moved to India when he was 50. And the Mahatma we know, the famous person we know, is actually the post, he's 50, Gandhi. And he always thought that civilization was more about being civil rather than be about building industries or material progress. And this is Gandhi with Tagore, Gandhi's contemporary. Tagore actually wrote an essay towards the end of his life saying that we didn't have the word civilization. The Europeans brought it. We had to translate it. We had to coin a new word in our languages. In northern languages, North Indian languages, it's called sabhyata. But the word sabhya, to which we add ta to create the word for civilization, the word sabhya originally meant member of an association or society. But somehow that was expanded and you added ta to it to create this new word. And but looking at the two wars, many of these Europeans who were critical of Europe and European supremacy, as well as Indian nationalists, were deeply convinced that a civilization that led to the two great wars, the Great War and the Second World War, had something fundamentally wrong with it. In fact, there's a very interesting letter about 1920s written by the great English political scientist Harold Lasky to Felix Frankfurter, who was both a professor of law at Harvard and a very well-known Supreme Court judge, in which actually Lasky says, the fact is, Felix, he used to call him as Felix, we should not be there in India to rule it. Even if they make a mess of their own country, we don't have a right to be there. And that is not civilized to be there. So there was kind of this shared understanding through the framework of civilization as to what was wrong with British rule and with, and Tagore, who was critical of aggressive nationalism, saw other countries, Asian countries, picking up this idea of Western idea of civilization. It was very critical. In the last essay, which was called Crisis of Civilization, which he wrote in 1941, the year he died, he actually struck a very despondent note and said, I had at one time believed that the springs of civilization would issue out of the heart of Europe. But today, when I'm about to quit the world, that faith has gone bankrupt altogether. And yet, in essays written about the same time, he actually acknowledges what India owed to Europe. And he lists out 4 important things that he said, the British are not personally close to us. There is racism in British rule, unlike there was before the British with the Mughals, there was no racism. But he said at the same time, there's a kind of intimacy that we have with the English, which we have never had with others because they came as the ambassadors of the spirit of Europe. And he said we owed something to the spirit of Europe. And there are 4 debts he points out. One, he says, one was the modern science or reason that Europe brought to India. So we owe to Europe modern science. The second important European idea was the idea of equality before the law, because India didn't have that. The third, he said, is the idea that no human being could be a property of another. The effort, he says, against converting humans into commodities. And this comes out of anti-slavery movement, but it is something that had a deep and profound effect on on challenging, in a modern way, the Indian institution of untouchability. In fact, the people who became utmost critics of the institution of untouchability around Bombay, initially Jyotiba Phule, later on Ambedkar, came from that region, mainly because in Phule's time it was the American missionaries who were actually bringing stories about slavery and anti-slavery sentiments and getting these people to read their own conditions as that of slavery. So when Jyotiba Phule, who wrote against untouchability, wrote a book in the 19th century, he called Gulamgiri, slavery. And therefore Tagore is saying that's something we owe to the West. And finally, he says, the message of self-rule, self-determination, or self-government was fundamentally a message that came from Europe. And Tagore writes that today, in spite of all our weaknesses, we can attempt to change the situation of our nation. And the state is due to our taking a stand on the ground of a European theory. It is on the strength of this theory that we fight clamorously with such a powerful government over demands we would never have been able to dream of raising with the Mughal emperor. And he actually quotes Robert Burns and a very famous line from a very famous song that the Scottish poet wrote, "A man's a man for all that." And Tagore actually mentions the Spanish Civil War, and he says this contradiction, this internal fracturing of a civilization, he captures in a sentence where he says, "We have witnessed from this distance how the British statesmen acquiesced in the destruction of the Spanish Republic. On the other hand, we also noted with admiration how a band of valiant Englishmen had laid down their lives for Spain." And the general principle which Tagore thought was part of that defined civilization, which he said several times between the 20s and 30s, he said, "We have seen Europe cruelly unscrupulous in its politics and commerce, widely spreading slavery over the face of the earth in various names and forms. And yet, in this very same Europe, protest is always alive against its own inequities." So the very mark of being civilized was actually the capacity to criticize your own institutions. That's why protest has always to be alive against the inequities in your own society, which is why Vivekananda, Gandhi, Tagore, in their own civilizational way, would all be absolutely critical of the institution of untouchability and approach it in different ways. I mean, that their own criticism later on fell out of favor with many Indians was a different story, but they were all completely unaccepting of the institution of untouchability. So this civilizational nationalism, which actually grew very powerful in the last part of 19th century, but as you can see in the lives of these people lived on till the 30s at least. came in for a lot of criticism and eventually rejection from the 1940s on. So that if you go back in India today and you try to speak like a Tagore or a Gandhi, people will think of you as a cranky uncle or sort of, a crackpot who's come back from somewhere. Today you have to use a very different language to make the same criticisms. And you begin to see these differences of generations emerge in those very intimate conversations with Nehru, who became the first prime minister of the country, and Gandhi, who was almost like a father figure to Nehru. Gandhi replaced, I think, even in Nehru's biography, he took the place of his own father, who also died earlier. But Gandhi and Nehru differed completely on what modern India should be like. And Gandhi, Tagore, and Vivekananda, they belong to a phase where, thanks to many Europeans, thanks to the way that Europeans thought about India, that civilizational nationalism assumed that the core of Indian civilized life is the village. That somewhere it was in the village and in the rural way of life that you found genuinely Indian values. And that's where Indian life lived on, whereas in the cities, life was mixed up with other values and other things. Nehru could never accept that. And it was ultimately the ex-untouchable leader, Ambedkar, who absolutely excoriated the leadership for their romanticization of the village. And he said, you guys have no idea how terrible the village is. And again, one of the interesting things about modern India is, of course, this huge rush towards urbanization. Even so, still 70% of India is rural, even today, in spite of all the urbanization that's happening. But if you look at the statistics and the predictions, then in another 20 years, India will be probably 50% urbanized or 60% urbanized. At least people will live in the cities, or slumified is how I should say it, not urbanized. So there are very interesting exchanges between these two people. In 1946, 2 years before Gandhi was killed, and Gandhi defends the vision he had of real civilization in that book he wrote in 1909, Hind Swaraj, and he writes to Nehru, he says, I still stand by the system of government envisaged in Hind Swaraj. No railways, no industries, no lawyers, he said. Lawyers lie. He said they're paid to lie. I don't want them, right? No doctors, because doctors only belong to a civilization that produces illnesses, so you need the doctors. Half of Gandhi's letters are about people's bowel problems in the collected works. So he says, I'm convinced that if India has to attain true freedom, and through India, the world has to attain true freedom, then sooner or later, people will have to live in villages, not in cities. Hundreds of thousands of people will never be able to live in peace with each other in towns and palaces. But you must not imagine that I'm envisaging our village life as it is today. My ideal village will contain intelligent human beings. There will be neither plague, nor cholera, nor smallpox. No one will be idle, and no one will wallow in luxury. To which Nehru replied, a village, normally speaking, is backward intellectually and culturally, and no progress can be made from a backward environment. We have to encourage the village to approximate more to the culture of the city. So you can see that even between friends, the older idea of civilization was coming into crisis. And the other big point, apart from the village falling out of favor as imagined as the seat of Indian civilization, the other interesting thing about this old cultural nationalism was that it didn't have a sense of what became realpolitik in India. The jockeying for power, the telling of lies at the hustings, making sure that there was voter turnout and people came and voted for you. All that begins to happen from the 1920s and 30s. And Gandhi is, of course, caught up in all that. On the side of Gandhi that's part of the Congress party, is the shrewd man, he's caught up in all that, but he still believes his ideal is not that. He always says, I carry a copy of the Gita, which is the holy book, for Hindus as a talisman to protect him from all the evil influences. And his volunteers did that. They all carried a copy of the Gita somewhere to protect themselves, but they took part in this politics. But whereas the other conception was very civilizational, as I said, it comes out in the writings of somebody I don't have a picture for, Aurobindo, another nationalist figure who became a religious figure after 1911, but who wrote wonderful stuff in the 1910s about civilization, and where he was saying elections are not important, political power is not important, what we need to have is the spirit of the nation. And if you read Aurobindo, you will see who they were reading. They were reading Mazzini. They were reading stories of Italian Risorgimento. They were reading about the storm and stress movement of Germany. So basically, there was a lot of German romantic idealism coming to them from different sources, creating the idea of a nation, but at the same time, not being able to anticipate the interest that Indians will actually come to have in holding seats in legislative assemblies, in actually going to the polling booth and voting, in fighting out in real terms, the power of this bloc versus that bloc. And soon, the Muslims began to say that, look, what you're calling civilization is very Hindu, because it's all dependent on these Sanskrit texts you've dug up, or the Europeans have dug up for you. And the lower caste began to say it's all very upper caste. So the idea of civilization fell out of favor. But there's one very interesting legacy of that old idea of civilization, and that is something that nobody can actually avoid, nobody can deny, which is the question of universal adult franchise. So India was most Indians were not literate at independence. Literacy was very, only a small portion of the population were literate. So on what basis did Indians actually go for universal adult franchise on independence? Because the entire training of the 19th century, where Indian intellectuals had grown up on John Stuart Mill's writing on liberalism and representative government, and Mill had said very clearly that you cannot have universal adult franchise until you have universal adult education. That you have to have an educated population for people to be able to make citizen-like decisions. And many Indians, not only these people in some respects, but even Ambedkar wrote something in the 40s saying, maybe not everybody is ready for the vote. But when people came to debate the question of universal adult franchise, which Gandhi had been asking for from 1921, very interesting arguments came up in the Constituent Assembly, where the Indian Constitution was kind of accepted. And the most clinching argument for giving everybody the vote was actually made by an Indian philosopher who once held the Spalding Professor of Indian Philosophy at Oxford, Radhakrishnan, who also was our first vice president, then became a president of the Republic. It was Radhakrishnan who went back to the civilizational nationalistic arguments to say in the Constituent Assembly debates that, look, our people may be illiterate, but we have had a long-standing civilization. And Indian civilization has done the job of literacy. Indian civilization has made the poorest of Indian peasant, the non-literate peasant, capable of making a citizenly decision on the day of the vote. And therefore, we should give everybody the vote. So what gave people the confidence to think that you could trust the ordinary Indian with this big responsibility of choosing how we should be governed? What gave them that confidence was that older argument, which they took seriously, about having been an old civilization. And the argument was that civilization itself must have given people a certain kind of wisdom, which older nationalists had found in folk stories, in folk songs, in folk literature. So they had argued by the end of the 19th century, when there was a folklorist movement, that you can go to the village and listen to stories, listen to songs to see how much of wisdom there is in Indian people. And that kind of wrong reading in some ways of Indian history, or that culturalist reading, gave them the confidence to give everybody the vote. And Radhakrishnan actually said the Republican tradition is very old, because what happened in 1911, we discovered a manuscript called the Arthashastra in the Mysore Maharaja's library. And it was an old, ancient text on politics and economics. And the moment it was discovered, all Indians jumped, intellectuals jumped up in joy and said, here's our Machiavelli. It actually proves that we are very civilized. And if you go back in history, you'll find a lot of people wrote books in the 1910s with titles like Ancient Self-Government or Self-Government in Ancient India, the Republican Tradition in Ancient India. And Radhakrishnan pointed to that literature to say the Republican tradition is old, so we should give everybody the vote. And therefore, one legacy of that nationalism is the vote, which is a ritual we're going to again enact from tomorrow on. So the question is, was that an unmixed blessing? The answer today would be mixed. In the 50s, everybody would have said, it's wonderful. This is where this debate comes up. And the Columbia University economists, the debate about growth rate and labor flexibility and labor wages, the Columbia University economist Aravind Panagaria, who teaches there, wrote recently that even in the 1950s, labor legislation in India was at par with that in the most developed countries along most dimensions. And Panagaria actually cites the very well-known Indian statistician Mahalanobis, who was the architect of the first 5-year plan under Nehru. And Mahalanobis wrote an essay somewhat ruefully saying that Indian welfare measures tended to be ahead of economic growth. For example, he says, in labor laws, which are probably the most highly protective of labor interests in the whole world. In other words, Indian laws, labor wages were fixed and decided with this idea in view that simply because we were poor as a nation, it did not mean that our people were not entitled to the highest democratic rights that people would have in the most developed countries. And that was an act of civility by the middle class and educated classes towards the ordinary people. That goes back to this old idea that a civilized country treats its people in a civil way. So, or take the question of Indian democracy, where Indians are proud of it, and legitimately so, but there's an emerging consensus that Indian politics has generally failed to produce good governance that economic progress requires. To many observers of India, politics has emerged as the problem to be fixed. And sometimes, even in Chicago, an Indian friend was saying to me the other day, you know, Dipesh, we should really have a presidential form of government. In other words, this parliament has become a problem. And if you could, like Russia now, I guess, if we could find a government where we vote parliamentarians but don't give them any power, and have some other intelligent group of people running the country, we would probably better run. And this question comes up from time to time. Thus, B.K. Nehru, a distinguished civil servant and a cousin of the first Prime Minister, blamed India's ills, poverty, population, corruption, populist measures, on entirely her politics in an essay that he published on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Indian independence, 1997. And this is what B.K. Nehru wrote. The reason why we have been unable to check these problems is that we have adopted a system of government that is totally unsuited to us, given our traditions, culture, and ethos. When we gave ourselves a constitution, we copied, with changes, the latest model of democratic structure, which then prevailed in the United Kingdom. We took little account of the fact that what was suitable for a rich, small, homogeneous country, which had taken 700 years to create its democratic governmental machine, was not suited to a miserably poor, vast, very diverse country whose people had had little opportunity of developing an ethos of self-government. And then he ended with a historical counterfactual. He said, if Britain had adopted her present constitution in Robin Hood's time, Robin Hood probably would have become the British Prime Minister, and a very popular one at that, but Britain would have reverted to barbarism and never been able to add the adjective great to itself anymore. Now, this may sound like an extreme position, but suspicion that our existing form of democracy does not quite deliver the goods is often voiced in a more muted form. Arun Shuri, who was actually a minister for divestment in India in BJP's last NDA-led government, spoke at a conference in Colombia, and he spoke of the need for India to have a presidential system of government if the country were to unleash its unlimited potential. And then he said, I realize that it's probably unlikely at the moment, but ironically, he pinned his hope on the continued breakdowns in governance in India. Because he said, if we have constantly bad government, maybe it will lead us to this change, because every breakdown is a breakthrough. We'll get tired of our breakdowns, and there'll be a consensus in the country that this is not working. Now, again, Mrs. Gandhi's time, Mrs. Gandhi got a minister in her cabinet, Vasant Sathe, to raise the same question in a paper that was circulated, should India have a presidential form of government? So now you can see that there's debate about what kind of form of government should we have. There's debate about, are our labor wages too high? Should we not take advantage of the opportunity that the Chinese labor costs have gone up, and now is the time to bring capital into India? These are at the heart of some of the debates to do with this election. The pro-growth people would often not say the presidential form of government, but actually talk about bring minimum wages down. As I said, I can't resolve economist debates. I'm not qualified to do it. But as a historian, I can say that when these debates go on, what I hear is really a clash between the legacy of that old cultural civilizational nationalism, which gave the confidence to India to actually give the vote to everybody, and another position which is head of post-liberalization kind of nationalism, which by implication says that in order for everybody to enjoy good government, the poor need to suffer a little more for the present. Right? So it's a question of how you value the poor in the present, not in the future. In the future, everybody loves the poor, because everybody wants the country to be rich. It's a question of what do you do about the poor now? And the old cultural nationalism has left us with a legacy of, whether we like it or not, of systems that are trying to be civil to the poor. And they clash against many economists' judgment that they're not economically helpful for liberalization and for growth. That's what I can say as a historian. Those are the thoughts I had shared. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, please.
Well, it seems to me, in addition to education and democracy, somehow you have to have a collective wisdom and a collective morality. And I think it has to be on a global basis, because otherwise you're going to have nations invading other nations. And in principle, I guess religion tries to do that, but I don't think it's succeeded too well.
Giving the wisdom.
Huh?
Giving the wisdom.
Wisdom and morality and all.
And sometimes unwisdom and immorality both.
Huh?
Particularly in India, it does both. Sometimes it gives wisdom and morality, and sometimes it's misused to create conflicts.
And I think if you had enough wisdom, you would realize the benefits of morality. But we have to do it collectively, which is what I think religion tries to do. And otherwise, people are forever destined to fighting each other and taking advantage of each other.
Yes, true. But the thing is, the older nationalists of Gandhi's time, or Tagore's time, or Vivekananda's, they probably thought that they knew from where this wisdom was. And they found it in certain texts. But then later on, the Muslims said these are Hindu texts. The lower caste says these are upper caste texts. And these are the texts you've used to oppress us. And that's where the agreement broke down. So they're all agreed on having elections. They're all agreed on, and certain legacies are there, as I was saying. Religion gets used in both ways. This morning, somebody was arrested for using religion to foment hatred between groups. That happens all the time. But as I said, it's a contradictory country, and we would be wrong to think that there's only one kind of nationalism. There are very different kinds of nationalisms. Everybody in the end is wanting good for the country, but they're wanting good for the country by different means. And then there's the whole question of the past of these iconicized people. But their passions and their emotions gave rise to certain institutions, like that of universal adult franchise. And that everybody now has an investment in. So we carry on with that. But I think the hope which that generation of the 1920s, 30s, 19th century had, that there would be one shared morality, I think that hope would, if you went to India now, would seem good but unrealistic. Yeah.
In your introductory remarks, you talked about labor-intensive jobs.
Right.
But in your comments, is there a movement now to somehow create labor-intensive jobs?
Well, the argument, at least that these people make, Panagaria and Jagdish Bhagwati make, that two obstacles to creating proper manufacturing but labor-intensive jobs, not in the informal sector where there are small workshops, but properly trained, give students, people the skills they need. From their point of view, there are two problems that in labor, at least in the domain of labor. One is that they think the wages should be more flexible, and they think labor conditions should be more flexible. It should be easier to fire labor. And the argument from the other side is that you can only do that if your judicial system is so good that people have recourse against unfair dismissal. But these economists point to that as a problem. They point to the handouts that the Congress government gives to people as a problem, sort of pushing labor wages up. Because now India has this law whereby everybody in the countryside is actually guaranteed 100 days employment, even if they don't work. And therefore their argument is that that pushes up wages. So they are in favor of, that's what I'm saying, they're in favor of transitioning to economy. So they said, first you have to create conditions for investment so that these people then get employed, they get the skills, eventually everybody will be better off. And the other argument seems to be that we can't make these people pay the entire cost of the transition, we should be giving them welfare while we are transitioning. That seems to be the main debate. And I'm saying the welfarist argument has some connection with the older nationalism. And I'm not saying that the people who are completely market-oriented are not nationalists. They're also wanting the good of the country. But that's where there's a clash between two different visions, as it were. Yeah.
What is the minimum wage in India? Is it universal?
You know, it sort of varies because the state also has a role. The states have a role in deciding it, but it's like,
What percentage of the
see, 90% of the people, 10%. Of the working population. That's the problem. So these people are saying that unless you have large-scale manufacturing, you will only have this informal sector. But large-scale manufacturing won't come, they're saying, unless they can hire and fire people. Because in India, it's very hard once you've employed people to fire them. And so they argue that labor conditions have become something that kind of impedes investment.
Could you give me a range of the minimum wages?
It's around 300 rupees a day.
What is that in our?
In our terms would be
$5.
$5, yeah.
An hour?
A day.
And that's considered a high?
That's considered high.
I see.
Yes. Yeah.
I understood that now that labor in China has become more expensive, manufacturing facilities have moved to Vietnam.
Yeah. And that's why Indians Indian capital is going to Bangladesh. A lot of the textile factories are are actually Indian capital. And as you know, in Bangladesh, you know that a few months ago, that huge structure fell down and 1,000 people got killed. And then the Europeans sat up and called in the Bangladeshi ambassador and said, we are not going to work in your country if you create conditions like that. But it's not like people didn't know that the conditions were bad. People knew that shoddy buildings were going up, right? It was not sort of a secret. And I guess, so the argument for investment, in effect, becomes an argument that says, throw the poor to the wolves for now, and the wolves will one day become sheep. At least to my hearing.
I guess there's just so many people who are going to be thrown to the
Well, the thing is, you see, even if, I personally feel I'll be quite comfortable with flexible labor conditions so long as you tone up your justice system so that they at least have some redress if against unfair dismissal. But the problem in India is that if you have unfair dismissal, it's very hard to have corrective action through the judicial system, which is so slow and clogged up. So in some respects, what I'm saying is that if you take the social structure, the social conditions into account, then the economists, the pure economic argument, which on its own sounds like a meritorious argument, has merit, it seems more, the situation on the ground seems more complicated, right? And plus, the situation on the ground has been created by the older nationalism and the older visions of how to bring welfare to people. Right? So it's actually a complex situation, a debate. There's somebody at the back. Yeah.
Is there any significant labor union role, or the only to the political parties? Is there?
Well, the thing is, labor union in the formal sector, are quite organized, and the laws are often pro-labor. And that's why it would be very hard to use the parliament to change these things. So some of the pro-growth people actually are wanting a government that will be more decisive, that will kind of break down the resistance. And that's why so much is turning on the question of growth at this election, because Indian growth rates have fallen. Indian growth rates are still ahead of global average growth rates. It's like 3.2, 3.9 in the last 2 years. Chinese growth rates have also fallen. I mean, the world is generally going through a slump, but they want to get back to 8% growth, right? And the debate is really, effectively on the ground, the debate is between economists who say we want investment, but we also give poor the protection of handouts and things. And economists who say that if you give the poor the handouts, like 100 days guaranteed employment, then they wouldn't have the incentive to come to the labor market and produce the competition that will push down, make wages more competitive. I mean, these debates go on, and as I say, as a historian, I see a kind of a tussle between a younger form of nationalist thinking and an older form of nationalist thinking. How this is going to get worked out depends on politics, depends on how much political power the growth people, the lobby will eventually have in the parliament. So that depends on, India is so regionalized, it depends on how the regional parties play out, right? How the votes play out in the states. Yeah.
It seems to me sort of the elephant in the room is the population is lower than that. And I know you don't necessarily want to get into the issue of policy, but is that acknowledged that that's really important?
It's
Is that's controversial?
No, I mean, okay, it's population has been, initially India didn't acknowledge the population problem for a long time. But once Kerala was able to make what they call population transition to a lower rate of birth, at least insofar as social analysis goes, people have proven that if women are educated, it makes a difference to how many kids they have, and therefore social indicators are important. So all that is recognized. But Mrs. Gandhi burnt her fingers trying to control population ruthlessly. And she lost the election. So I don't think anybody would come in with a Chinese-type population policy. But on the other hand, they realize this is where the situation is so complicated that if you have such a young population, it can be an advantage only if you can skill them and give them jobs, right? Otherwise, otherwise you'll have terrorism. You'll have all kinds of. It's a chicken and egg question. So population. About 5-6 years ago, they used to speak of population as a demographic dividend. But India doesn't have enough universities and colleges to actually educate these people, which is why when we go and set up our center, we haven't set up a campus, but they're desperate for these kind of collaborations to actually skill people. They've just set up something called Skills Corporation in India, where they're basically giving people money to run crash courses, like 3 months courses, to make somebody a certified electrician. It's really, I think they have to do it on a war footing. So you're totally right about population, and I think everybody understands that it's a problem, but nobody, because there's no solution in a democratic setup, so it doesn't sort of emerge as an election issue. Like no party will come and say population problem. The once or twice when population has been raised, it's been raised in a very nefarious way as a way of blaming the Muslims. You know, they have more wives, they create more children, and that's a kind of really wrong use of the population argument. Yeah.
Speaking of that, I tend to think in terms of Hindu nationalism, but you talked about Indian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see the dialectic between those two, or how are you framing that?
I think in some ways the people I talked about were probably the Muslims would call them soft Hindus, right? As opposed to a very hardline Hindu nationalists. So these people were all acknowledged, all of them would have acknowledged the role of Islam, the role of Sufism. Tagore's, the Brahmo Samaj, the Brahmo religion that you know about, which Tagore's family in some ways created, owed a lot to Sufism. But on the other hand, the language, the rhetoric, see, I mean, when Indian state was created, the Indian state's logo was taken either from Hindu heritage or from Buddhist heritage, like Ashokan heritage. And I personally always felt a little sorry that Indian state's logo had nothing Islamic about it, even though we claimed to be a nation for all as distinct from Pakistan. Yeah.
On the flexibility issue,
Yeah.
For just a moment, it seems like American experience is that when our unions were strongest and minimum wage highest in relationship to wages is when we had our biggest economic growth.
Right.
So that kind of, but I think it sort of argues that I think maybe that it's not
Right.
the most relevant issue. But it seems to me that more than population, the question of climate change will make all of this
Climate change is a very, yeah.
irrelevant.
Climate change is very interesting. Climate change is, that's where again, to go back to your population question. So when Indians go to international forums on climate change, apart from during the tenure of Jairam Ramesh, who was the environment minister in 2009, Indians will always say our per capita emissions are low, which they are. And that's because most people are poor. And so Jairam Ramesh was one Indian minister who actually once got tired of this and in the parliament said, our per capita emissions are low because we couldn't control the population problem and we couldn't solve the poverty problem. So you're making a virtue out of really two failures. But I think per capita figures, which actually Indians introduced into the climate, two Indian scholars, environmental activists, who introduced this mode of calculating emissions per capita basis in a booklet that actually was written against the GASPET's organization, World Resources Institute, right? Yeah. They wrote a book against him because he described climate change as everybody's problem. And they said it wasn't everybody's problem. And the book was called, at least the subtitle was Environmental Colonialism. And they first argued that emissions must be computed on a per capita basis. And I think there are questions of historical responsibility and all that. I think I grant them that. But I think the per capita figure both acknowledges and disavows the population problem.
But isn't the real problem parts per billion in the air, regardless
Yeah,
of where it's coming from?
true, but they don't, Indian negotiators are more interested in the historical responsibility argument. See, in the climate change field, as you know, some people think of climate change as an occasion for wealth transfer. So when they say that the Western countries, the developed countries must subsidize what the poorer countries do, so they actually see this as an occasion for so reducing the gap. And some people argue against that. Some people say that it's actually the PPM factor. It doesn't matter. Some people say industrialist countries are retrospectively guilty, and India and China are prospectively guilty, right? So I'm just reporting to you what the Indian position is. The Indian position, I think, both acknowledges in an indirect way that there's a question of population, but actually disavows it. Yeah.
The emergence of women into the middle class, does that affect the political landscape very much?
Sorry, say that again.
The emergence of women into the middle class landscape of
Where do the
economy, how much has that affected the political landscape? landscape are you defending of women?
Okay, so I'll just show you some slides, and maybe to make that the last question. Is that Dan? We're at the end of the time? Yeah. Okay. So I'll just show you some slides about women's activism. So these you can't see it properly. These actually were from 2008, when Valentine's Day was being celebrated, and in a town called Mangalore, some young women who'd gone to a pub to drink were mishandled and beaten up by a bunch of thugs, in my terms, who described themselves as Hindu nationalists and said, Hindu women don't drink and therefore we're going to beat you up. And so that's still these people. They're destroying a Valentine's Day symbol. Now, so women, the man who led this movement, he was recently given a ticket actually by BJP, and then because people objected, they withdrew the ticket. The man who started this was called Muthalik. And Muthalik had actually worked in the army once, and then he's created his own Hindu outfit called Ram Sene, Soldiers of Rama, the Hindu god king. And then women started this movement where they were saying, they actually had newspaper, animated newspaper cartoons, I'll show you. They were inviting women of India to send this man this pink underwear, women's underwear, as presents. And the Hindi term for underwear is chaddi, women's underwear. It's called chaddi. So it's called the Pink Chaddi campaign. And I'll just show you the animation. So you'll see kind of the sense of where it's at. This is Muthalik. So that's how the animation went. I mean, I couldn't do it quickly enough. So there's Muthalik trying to talk, and the women produce this. And it's a complex. I actually think it's a culturally complex phenomenon because there was humor in it, quite biting humor. Some people would say even queer humor in what women were doing. And this was they called themselves feminist, loose, whatever, characterless women. And he got thousands of these underwear sent to him. And but it shows activism, but it also shows a public domain where they were practicing actual violence, these goons. But this was also humorously, kind of symbolically gagging them, right? And it just shows an overall, a culture of probably more aggression in our public sphere. Unlike what Gandhi or Tagore would have called civility, that kind of an argument. But they're powerful, these groups, and it happens in the public sphere. Okay, so with that, we'll call it to an end. Thank you again very much.